All right, welcome to Ethical Storytelling. My name is Zach Layton. I'm the founder and principal creative at Reliant Creative. I founded the ministry in 2011 because I believe that God is working in powerful ways globally. And if we can tell those stories, we can inspire action and mobilize the church. Our purpose is to help the church testify of all that Jesus is doing. I've been working in the ministry space for more than a decade now, and I'm surprised how little I've seen or heard on this subject of ethical storytelling. Now, don't get me wrong, content exists around this idea, but it's very limited. The ethics behind our storytelling is something we all need to take into consideration before we embark on a storytelling journey or project. Guilt marketing and poverty porn are real things. They were most prevalent in the 80s and 90s, but ministries and nonprofits the world over still use these principles in their marketing, even if they aren't aware that they are using these principles. Ignorance isn't an excuse to exploit those that we serve for our ministry's marketing and financial benefit. With that said, I don't subscribe to the belief that we shouldn't tell stories at all, or that we should focus all of our attention in our stories on the hope and ignore the conflict. I think if we're not careful, we can swing the pendulum too far to the other side of the spectrum and either not storytell at all or simply focus on the hope of the story. Both options are just as bad as partaking in guilt marketing. There are ways to storytell well, to tell stories that dignify the characters and the beneficiaries of our stories and protect the identities of the people in those stories. And that's what we're going to discuss today. I love this quote by Robert McKee. It's a powerful statement, but I want to look deeper at this quote than its surface level meaning. Yes, I believe storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world. But I also think this is why we need to take the ethics of our storytelling so seriously. If we're not careful with our storytelling, we can easily cause damage and harm. If we're not approaching our storytelling ethically, we can easily put false narratives and bad ideas into the world for the quote unquote benefit of our ministries. Storytelling is the most powerful tool we have to put ideas into the world. We need to take this seriously on all fronts. So, what is guilt marketing, and poverty porn? And why do we have a problem with this form of storytelling? Or maybe said another way, why don't more ministries have a problem with this type of storytelling? Now, let me be clear. I also think that your ministry's sole focus or primary focus on your ministry as the hero in the story is perpetuating the problem. Touting your ministry as the hero that comes in to save the day for the poor and the oppressed, which is what we are doing when we tell quote unquote stories that show how great our ministries are. It's no different than telling a story that only focuses on the pain and suffering in any given situation. I've said it 1,000 times. Your ministry is not the hero. You're stealing glory from God when you focus all of your stories on the great work your ministry has done. You are stealing glory from God when you focus all of your attention on your latest About Us video rather than creating films that testify of God's great work in real people's lives. And to be fair, since that might have sounded a little harsh, there's nothing wrong categorically with your ministry's About Us videos or your end of year ministry highlight videos. The problem lies in your overall content output. If that's the only content you're producing, that's where the problem lies. As for poverty porn and guilt marketing, how many times have you seen images and films that degrade children and show them at their lowest points without ever sharing any hope? And then these images are paired with messages that read something like, "You can feed this hungry child for just a penny a day." That message may be true. The reality that that child is living in poverty, that they are starving to death, that reality might be true as well. But the message ultimately doesn't tell the full story. These are irresponsible marketing practices because that's rarely ever the full story. When we share stories, create films, and show images like this, we are degrading the very people we are trying so hard to lift up. We are all created in God's image with value and worth, regardless of our cultural backgrounds, upbringings, or socioeconomic situations. The child you're trying to rescue out of poverty or trafficking have the same value and worth as the donor you're communicating to. We've got to stop degrading our beneficiaries with the images that we use to represent their situations. We have to be better. And to be fair, that's where the tension lies for mission-driven marketing teams and ethical storytelling, right? How do we communicate the severity of the problem without shaming and degrading the people we're trying to help? I believe the answer can be found in a handful of best practices and the hero's journey that we've spent so much time exploring throughout this series. Now, to start, let's explore some best practices that we can all follow when telling our ministry's stories. Use these best practices as a starting point and a guide. This is not an exhaustive list, but it should get you moving and thinking, at least in the right direction. First and foremost, we are telling stories of real people. These are real lives with real emotions. Build a relationship with the individual who has offered to tell their story. Get to know them and try to empathize with what they've gone through and experienced. You might find that their story, as horrific and tragic as it might be, might and probably will have some similarities with your own story. Don't just take good care of the story. Care for the person sharing their story. Show your beneficiary in a dignified way in your stories, and don't be afraid to highlight their smiles. Remember, these are real people with real emotions, with real highs and real lows. Second, tell the story well. We have a responsibility to take special care of these stories. Work hard to tell their stories well. When you're telling a beneficiary's story, understand that you have a great responsibility to do right by the individual who has chosen to share something so intimate and personal. Remember our definition of story. Conflict changes life. The conflict portion of the story is most likely going to be difficult for them to open up about and share. Compassion and empathy with these stories is crucial. Third, and this is probably and should probably come first if we're putting these in rank order, but please get permission from your beneficiary to tell their story. Always ask permission to tell their story. Never assume you have permission. Additionally, get their input. It's their story. Always remember to get consent in identification, meaning you need consent to use their name and identity. If it's a situation where identification isn't possible, maybe because it's not safe, don't give up on that story. You can always use pseudonyms and actors to achieve your storytelling goals or tell stories in written form. Fourth, please avoid over-dramatization, stereotyping, and simplifying someone's story. Stories are complex. Allow them to be complex. At the same time, any story of transformation is powerful. It doesn't need to be over-dramatized. Fifth, communicate with your beneficiary how their story will be used. We addressed this a little in number 3 when we said to get their input. Talk with them about how you plan to communicate their story. Bring them along for the ride and the storytelling journey. We've talked about Dr. Kurt Thompson and his research on the power of storytelling and how it has the power to emotionally and even physically heal us. Sharing a story of transformation might be a healing experience for someone, but it can also heal others as they engage with the story. Talk with your beneficiary about how their story has impacted you and your team. Additionally, communicate with them about their story and how it's going to be shared and for what purpose it'll be communicated to the world. Many people share their stories because they want to help others avoid what they've experienced or gone through. Children who have been rescued from various forms of trafficking often want to share their stories because they want to help other children experience the same rescue. Communicating with your beneficiary how their story will be used can be an encouragement to the storyteller. But more importantly, you're respecting their story and bringing them along the journey, making them feel a part of the team rather than someone whose story is being exploited. Sixth, seek advice in gray area situations and default to your beneficiary or ministry partner's requests. Oftentimes, you'll be working with a national partner who is facilitating the relationship between your ministry's leadership or your marketing team and the beneficiary and their story. Get your national partners and your beneficiaries' advice throughout the process. Your national partner will know the story and the emotional state of the beneficiary better than you do. It's important to lean on their insight and experience. Seventh, tell your beneficiary's story using a medium that makes your beneficiary comfortable. They might not want to be on camera or in a film, but they may be perfectly content to have their story told in written form. It's important to note that you'll want to avoid making travel plans for a film before you get an answer to this question or their preference. It'll be a bummer to show up for a film in country when your beneficiary doesn't want to be on video, but you could have told their story from your offices back in the States with written word. Eighth, it's important to realize that sometimes it's better not to share. That's okay. There's not a shortage of stories to tell if God is working through your ministry. He has no shortage of stories highlighting his redemptive work. If the beneficiary isn't ready to tell their story, or they're in a phase of their story that's not complete, wait and tell it later. Wait till they've experienced and gone through the mourning or the difficulty that they might come out of any given story. Wait till they're ready to tell their story, or don't tell it at all. Ninth, remember that transparency with your audience is essential. Always tell the truth. Are these true events or a fictional story based on true events? If you're using a pseudonym, communicate that to your audience. No one will care if you're using a pseudonym. In fact, they'll appreciate that you're telling stories ethically. But your audience will be furious if they find out you're not telling the truth or the whole truth. Transparency is key. 10th, and this one is kind of an umbrella rule that encompasses all of the best practices, but don't exploit stories for your ministry's benefits. This should be self-explanatory, but exploiting your beneficiary for the sake of your marketing efforts is hardly different than what someone might have experienced in their past. If you're telling someone's story to raise a few fundraising dollars, but you're dramatizing the story, telling the story without permission, or leaving out portions of the story because you feel it makes the story more engaging, your practices are no different than those that might have oppressed that individual for their own financial benefit. It doesn't matter how altruistic your ministry's efforts are. Exploiting someone's story for your marketing efforts should be avoided at all costs and in all circumstances. 11th, please use common sense. Most of these best practices can be wrapped up and summarized in this single best practice or this single rule. If someone has gone through trauma and hasn't gone through therapy, are they really ready to share their story? And 12th, and arguably most importantly, tell the full story. Find the balance between conflict and hope. A needs-based or conflict-only story is not a full story. A hope-only story is not a full story. Don't exploit the conflict and use guilt marketing principles to share a partial story. Tell the full story and balance the hope and conflict to the best of your ability. And those are our best practices for ethical storytelling. Again, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it should get you moving in the right direction and telling your stories ethically. Now, earlier I asked a tough question. How do we communicate the severity of the problem without shaming and degrading the people we're trying to help? I've said countless times throughout this series that we have to find the balance between the conflict and the hope. But how do we actually tangibly do that? This is where the hero's journey comes into play yet again. So let's dive in. I talked about this at length in previous courses, but one of the things that makes having a story structure so important is that it gives us a plug and play structure that we can all follow every single time we tell a story. If you plug your stories into this structure, and again, all stories follow this structure, all of our stories, every single one of us follow this structure throughout life. If we follow this structure, you're going to come away with a story that is balanced between conflict and hope, because the story structure has that balance baked into the model or the structure. The character needs something isn't right. They meet a guide who calls them to adventure. They cross the threshold and go on a journey. The character searches for the solution to their need on the road to trials. They find it, take it, and return to their ordinary world having changed. The character passes through the ordinary world and into the special world and returns having changed to their ordinary world. There's balance in the structure between the conflict and the hope. There's balance between the need or the conflict in step 2 and the change or hope that takes place in step 8 when the character has changed. So back to our big question. How do we communicate the severity of the problem without shaming and degrading the people we're trying to help? We find balance between conflict and hope. How do we find balance between conflict and hope? We plug our stories into a structure that already has that balance. And that's all I have for you guys today. As always, here's a list of some great resources as you explore storytelling and the hero's journey. You can get access to this deck on the resources page on our website. We've also got a handful of other resources that you can download, so be sure to check that out. If you'd like to learn more about how we can help you better tell stories, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us at reliantcreative.org, where you'll find more information about our services, and you can book a call with us from there. We're also posting educational content on a weekly basis on our website and social platforms, so be sure to follow along so you don't miss the content we're sharing. Our purpose is to help the church testify of all that Jesus is doing. If you're looking for help in that area, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks, everyone. It was great to be with you today. Ethical storytelling is important. Let's work together to tell better stories and tell them more often.